Europe is facing a potentially devastating winter. Russia's throttling of natural gas supplies is calling into question the continent's ability to heat homes and power the economy, especially as the temperature drops. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland acknowledged that harsh reality in a sweeping speech last night in the U.S., arguing the world's democracies must shore up friendships and economic ties in the face of rising authoritarianism.
The EU set a powerful example during the COVID pandemic, when European vaccine makers honored their contracts with non-European allies. Canada remembers. Canada must and will show similar generosity in fast-tracking, for example, the energy and mining projects our allies need to heat their homes and to manufacture electric vehicles.
The prospect of fast-tracking energy projects will be of keen interest to Canada's allies. This summer, the Chancellor of Germany made it clear Canada could help with Europe's energy security.
Really like Canada to export more LNG to Europe, yes. In a very, very short time, we build pipelines to the northern shore. We will build ports at many places for importing natural gas, liquid natural gas, LNG.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, however, poured cold water on that request, questioning the business case for it. Jonathan Wilkinson is Minister of Natural Resources. He's with us from Vancouver. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. Good to have you back on our program.
Thank you very much.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland says energy projects our allies need must and will be fast-tracked. Which projects is she referring to?
Well, I think she's referring to a whole range of projects. It's not dissimilar to what I've been saying when I've gone across the country talking to chambers of commerce. It's about fast-tracking projects that are required for us to move through the energy transition in a manner that will sustain and enhance Canada's economic prosperity. That's mining of critical minerals, that's hydrogen-related projects, that's LNG projects that are done in a manner that's consistent with the net zero goal. It's a whole range of things associated with Canada becoming a clean energy supplier to the world.
Okay, let me zero in then on LNG. And you said consistent with, I think, I don't want to say word for word, but net zero goals is basically what I took from that. I just want to be clear, because the way in which the reason this part of the Deputy Prime Minister's speech kind of resonated was because it seemed to be at odds with things that we've heard the Prime Minister say in the past, or even the actions of your government where LNG is concerned. So let me ask you to be blunt. Is the government in favor of fast tracking the export and infrastructure capacity of LNG in this country?
Well, we're certainly interested in seeing these projects move forward, so long as they are done in a manner, as I said, that's consistent with the fight against climate change. Climate change hasn't gone away. On the West Coast, you know that the LNG Canada facility will be coming on stream in 2024, and the wood fiber facility, now that Enbridge owns a chunk of it, is likely coming on stream in 2026 or 2027. We're certainly interested in the opportunity for LNG, but obviously it has to be done in a manner that minimizes domestic emissions. That means you got to have things like methane regulations on the upstream. That means you've got to have electricity to do the liquefaction at the point where you're actually going to be shipping the product. And it means that you actually have to engage the international community around ensuring that you're displacing heavier hydrocarbons like coal. And that's a conversation I have already been engaging in with a number of leaders in the industry, and we were going to be working on that as we move forward. But yes, we are very interested in that opportunity.
So what does that mean, for example, for the 18 projects since 2011 that have been approved? You mentioned the one that's actually under construction. The other 17 aren't. Does that mean that they, from your perspective, don't meet the criteria that you just set forward? Is that criteria designed to make sure that those projects don't go ahead?
No, not at all. And I would say that many of the projects that were brought forward, some were approved, some were never made it through the regulatory process, but they were all assessed under SIA 2012, which was the Harper era environmental assessment process. One of the reasons why we put into place the Impact Assessment Act was to ensure that good projects could move ahead in a manner that actually was consistent with environmental sustainability and discharging our obligations, our constitutional obligations to Indigenous peoples. But certainly we are interested in these kinds of projects, but they have to be done in a manner that is consistent with the commitment to achieving net zero by 2050 and working with our international partners to ensure that that's the case. Like, energy security issues are very, very important, and monetizing Canada's resources are very important. But so is climate change. Climate change is an existential threat. It hasn't gone away. You haven't heard those words come out of the mouth of the new Conservative leader. I think at some point, one has to actually ask the Conservative Party, are they actually interested in finding pathways through which you can do both, which I am very interested in doing, and so is the Deputy Prime Minister, or are you just going to ignore the fact that climate change exists at all?
Okay, I mean, certainly if the Conservatives are on, and many times they are, I've asked them those questions, but I'm here to ask the government questions about the actions that you're taking or that you're not. And just for our viewers' information, I mean, I take your point about the criteria and the importance and the significance of climate change. In no way would we want to minimize the existential threat we face there. But in the United States, where also the president currently espouses great concern for the effects of climate change, that country is set to actually become the world's largest LNG exporter, or have the most LNG export capacity by the end of this year. They exported the most in the first month of this year of any country in North America. Why are they able to do that and rectify it with their concern for the effects of climate change, and your government appears unable to do so?
Well, I would say actually the Americans are taking a very similar approach to us. I mean, they are also focused on both the energy security issue and the climate issue. So they are interested in following us with respect to methane regulations. They are looking at how they can use clean electricity to electrify and minimize domestic emissions. They're very interested in the idea of displacement of heavier hydrocarbons around the world. That's exactly what we are doing. And in fact, in many respects, with respect to the climate issues, the Americans are catching up to us. We are very interested in actually moving this forward, but it has to be done in a manner that is consistent with addressing the climate issue. And let's not get so tied up just on LNG. I mean, Canada has enormous opportunities with respect to hydrogen derived from natural gas and from renewables. We have enormous opportunities with respect to critical minerals, minerals processing, battery manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing. You know, Canada is enormously well situated to be the clean energy supplier of choice to the world as we go through this transition. But you have to actually take climate seriously and energy policy seriously.
With respect, the reason I'm tied up with LNG is because I sat across from the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, when he said to me he would want more LNG from Canada, but the infrastructure doesn't exist. And again, with great respect, I take your point about how the United States is aligned with Canada on climate change, but they have managed to increase their exports and help with the energy crisis and energy security around the world at a time when this country has not. How are our allies supposed to believe the Deputy Prime Minister when she says we have to fast track it and we will fast track it when the evidence shows otherwise?
Well, I would just say, Vashti, a couple of things you said are true. So the first is that Canada has augmented and is in the process of augmenting the supplies of hydrocarbons that it sends to the world. We committed
nowhere near how the United States
by,
has.
By 300,000 barrels a day by the end of the year. That was part of a commitment we made alongside the Americans and the Brazilians. In terms of LNG, as you know, LNG Canada will be going on stream in 2024 and the wood fiber facility likely soon thereafter. But when you're talking about the Germans, you're really talking about the East Coast. And believe me, I talk to my counterpart, the Vice Chancellor, all the time. The issue there is simply that you actually have a long way to actually ship gas from Alberta to New Brunswick. You have to make upgrades to the existing infrastructure that exists, and that has to be accounted for in the context of the business case. And that means that the product is going to likely be a bit more expensive than what they could get from the Gulf Coast, where the gas fields are located more closer. And so at the end of the day, those conversations continue to go on, both at a government-to-government level and at a business level. But the Germans have to be willing effectively to pay a premium for the gas. And so long as they are, that's fantastic. But the Germans actually have to come to that determination. So we've had that conversation directly with the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor.
No, and I understand it's not untrue. I actually spoke with the Chancellor myself. He said those words to me. And with respect to the increase in exports of hydrocarbons, I take your point on that, and we've talked about that before. But the exports of LNG in Canada compared to the U.S. over the same period you can't compare them. The U.S. has been able to, while insisting on the same goals where climate change and the effects of climate change are concerned, has been able to increase LNG exports to a degree that Canada has not. Even the number of facilities, 5 are currently under construction. Between 2014 and 2020, the U.S. built 7 LNG export facilities. I take your point about you being in favor of that happening, but it hasn't yet.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, again, I would go back to one of the impediments to getting some of these projects done was the regulatory regime that was in place under the Harper government, which destroyed confidence in the environmental assessment process, meant that Indigenous communities often felt excluded from the process, meant that environmental activists were often very suspicious of the process, and it simply meant that many of these projects just never got done. That's why we brought in the Impact Assessment Act, was to ensure that people could have comfort that the environmental issues were addressed, that Indigenous obligations were fulfilled, but that we could move good projects forward. And that's exactly what we are going to do. As you know, the Impact Assessment Act has only been in place for a couple of years now, but that's exactly how we intend to move forward. It's important to acknowledge environmental concerns. It's also important to acknowledge energy security and economic concerns, but both of those have to be considered.
You're absolutely right. There were huge issues with the process that was put into place under the Harper government, and there are many genuine questions that were directed their way. Your party has, however, been in power for 7 years.
That's absolutely right. But I would say that in terms of the process, the Impact Assessment Act has only been in place now for 2 or 3 years. And some of the projects, in fact, one of the first LNG projects to come through that process will be before the government in the next number of months. So we will start to see the process as it was intended to, how it actually comes to fruition and how we can actually ensure that, as I say, good projects take place. But, with respect to LNG, I would say one more thing, which is it is important that we actually are thinking about how to monetize resources. But it's also important to think about how those resources are monetized in a manner that's consistent with climate change. It is not good enough for people to simply say we should extract more natural gas and send it over, and we will just assume that there is an emissions reduction. We have to do our part with respect to reducing emissions domestically, and we have to verify that we're displacing heavier, harder carbons externally. That's work, and that's work that we are doing with the sector, and we are going to be doing with our counterparts in other countries around the world. But it is not good enough for people like the Conservative Party to simply say, you can assume that. You can't. You actually have to do the work.
Okay, Minister, I'm out of time. Thank you for your time as always.
All right, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.